Welcome to PIDE podcast show. I am Abdul Jalil, the professor of economics in Pakistan Institute of Development Economics, PIDE. Today, I have an honor to have Professor Joel Mokyr. Professor Joel Mokyr is a professor of economics and history in Northwestern University. Professor Mokyr specializes in economic history, the economics of technological change, and the economics of population change. And surely he is an authority in his field. He has honored over 100 articles and books in his field. His book have won a number of important prizes, including the Joseph Schumpeter Memorial Prize. He has served as the senior editor of Journal of Economic History, and he was editor-in-chief of Oxford Encyclopedia of Economic History. And Professor Mokyr has served as a president of Economic History Association and the president of Midwest Economic Association and the president of Atlantic Economic Association, and currently is a director of National Bureau of Economic Research. And surely there's a long list and I cannot complete in this short span of time. Professor, welcome to our show and good morning. Now the formally good morning, actually. Just start with a warming up question, Professor. Professor, what do you think? What is history and what is the history of economics? I mean, is it a union of two subjects? I mean, the history and economics are an intersection of two subjects. Your thoughts, Professor?
Well, I have two answers to that. The first is that the way academia is organized today, the fields of economics and the fields of history are quite separate. I mean, in my university, I have an appointment in both departments, and moving from one building to another, it's like you move to a different world, a different planet. I mean, people think differently, people talk differently, they have different politics. I mean, these are quite different worlds. At the same time, of course, the two fields have a very, very strong connection, because almost every area that we do in economics is relevant to the past. If you think about it, fields like international trade or labor economics or the econology or macroeconomics, all of those are relevant in the past, because in the past people traded, and in the past people worked, and in the past people had governments. And so everything that we do as economists is important if we're to studying history. And so the way I think about myself as sort of my intellectual persona is, I use economics to understand history, and I use history to understand economics. But what I'm particularly, of course, interested in is economic development and economic growth and technological progress, which basically made our modern world.
Oh, great. Thank you. What do you consider to be the hallmark of outstanding research in economic history? I mean, why are you the historian, economic historian, I mean?
Well, there's lots of important issues that we as economic historians are involved in. And the main, here, let me give you an analogy. So suppose you are a biologist, you're interested in evolution. Well, you wouldn't only be studying the species that exist in the world today, because they are a very small sample of the species that are possible and that ever lived, right? You have to do paleontology, because 99% of all the animals and all the plants that existed on this planet aren't there anymore. So if you confine yourself to studying the present, you would miss most of what's possible. The same is true in economics. I mean, you want to study things that no longer exist, at least not in the form that we use them. So, for instance, we study in American economic history is the institution of slavery. No longer an institution that we have, but the economics of slavery are very different from the economics of other labor markets. We study the economics of migration. Now, there's still migration going on in the world, but as everybody knows, Not everybody can enter the United States today. You have to have, an immigration permit and so on. But until 1921, anybody could enter the United States. So the population of immigrants that we were attracting is very different than what we have today. So if you want to understand things like that, I mean, I could make this list infinitely long, obviously. You could think about things like feudalism. So, feudalism existed in Europe in the Middle Ages, it existed in China in antiquity, it existed in Japan. We don't have feudalism in the world anymore. So if you want to understand, the economics of feudalism, you have to look at the past. And it's a very interesting institution that works very different than our monetized modern market economies.
Oh, great. Now, Professor, there is a huge discussion in the literature about the question of rich and poor countries. And that there is a number of researchers, for example, Lands and Robert Lucas and Charles Jones and Ashmoglu, Kramer and many other, they discussed in their writings. But this is the biggest unanswered question, But however, we can find the roots of this research question in the Industrial Revolution. And this is your field, I think. And we can safely claim that the Industrial Revolution has a significant place in the history of mankind. And the Industrial Revolution departed the nation into two main spheres, I mean the developed and the non-developed countries. What do you think? Was the Industrial Revolution inevitable? If and yes, then why is this Industrial Revolution happened in Britain, and why it did not happen in China, India, or any other part of the subcontinent? And I mean, what was the recipe of the Industrial Revolution? What was missing in China and India? What do you think, Professor?
Oh man, that is
a long question. But sorry.
The question you just asked me, you could spend a lifetime reading about and still only scratch the surface. It's huge, and I couldn't possibly answer this in half an hour. I've been thinking about this for many years, and I always quote my old friend Bob Lucas, a famous economist from the University of Chicago, who once wrote a memorable sentence. He says, once you start thinking about that question, it's hard to think of anything else. And so there are many arguments that are being made about. In a way, it helps to first to divide it into two questions. The first is the difference between Europe and the rest of the world. Okay, so the Industrial Revolution happened in Western Europe. It did not happen, as you said, in China, nor did it happen in India or in Africa or in the Islamic Middle East, in the Ottoman Empire. It didn't happen in Russia. It happened in Western Europe. And so the question, of course, is what is it about Western Europe that is different? And then the other question is that even within Western Europe, we see big differences. We see Britain being in a position of leadership and other countries coming on board a little bit later, France, Germany, Austria, places like that. So those are separate questions, and they can be analyzed in a different way. But so people have talked about, for instance, difference in geography. Europe has a better climate because it isn't very, very hot. It isn't very, very cold. It's sort of a temperate climate. And, Montesquieu, for instance, thought that, places in the world that are very hot would never do well because things were too hot for people to work. He may never have seen the Egyptian pyramids, for all I can tell. But then there's of course all kind of nonsense theories that I utterly reject. For instance, there is an argument that credits Christianity that says, well, Christianity is a better religion for economic development. And this is complete nonsense, of course, because in the year 1000. There was Christianity in Europe, and Europe was about as backward as it gets, whereas the Middle East was flourishing in technology and science and philosophy and mathematics and medicine. And so clearly the religion itself doesn't do anything. And of course, with China, this is even more difficult because it's not even clear that China has a religion, that, that Chinese philosophy, that Confucianism isn't really a religion, it's a philosophy, but it's not really a religion the way, Judaism or Islam are religion. So These are all nonsense. And then, of course, there's even the stupider theories that talk about, white people having an advantage over non-white people. All this is complete rubbish. What I think matters is to look at what happens in Europe in the 2 centuries before the Industrial Revolution and see what factors were critical in preparing the ground, so to speak, to plowing the soil and fertilizing it, so that when with the seeds of the Industrial Revolution are planted, they will actually succeed. And maybe it would be pedagogically useful to make the following comparison. In the 11th and 12th century, China is an extremely successful economy. This is under the Song dynasty, and they are doing many of the things that Europe ended up doing. They are producing cotton, which was, of course, very much part of the Industrial Revolution in Britain. They were producing iron. They were inventing all kind of clever machinery that eventually found its way to Europe. And, if you had lived at the time and you knew the future, you would say, well, we are on the verge of an industrial revolution in China. And then oddly, of course, under the Mongol dynasty, the Yuan dynasty, and then later on under the Ming, and most remarkably under the Qing dynasties, all the way until 1912, China really, is stagnating. It isn't developing. And Europe is able to take the same ideas, working on things like the mechanization of cotton production and so on, and turn them into something much bigger. And then the question really is, well, what exactly is the difference? So let me give you one suggestion, which is sort of plays an important role in my book. And that's the following. Every human society in history, to some extent, is subject to what I call intellectual ancestor worship. And what I mean by that is that people are convinced that in the past, people were smarter than people are. The answer to anything, you go and you read the authorities, and you read the canon, as it's known, the books of wisdom that were given to us by our past leaders, and you find the answer there. So in the West, for instance, for many years, the biggest canon at all was Aristotle. So if you were somebody living in the Middle Ages, and you wanted the answer to a question about astronomy or physics, then you read about medicine, you read people like Galen and Ibn Sina. There were all these authorities that everybody was relying on. And then, the Jews, had the same kind of thing, and they studied the Talmud, right? So if you wanted to know the answer, everything is in the Talmud. You just go and find the answer. And in China, you have the same thing happening. You get the Neo-Confucian school of Juqi and other people, and that was all the wisdom you needed to know. And so people just look at the past. In Islam, it was, obviously the Quran and Hadith, things like that. Now, what happens in Europe, and this is I find this an incredibly interesting phenomenon, is that around 1500, so about 2 centuries before the Industrial Revolution, intellectuals start saying, you know what, the wisdom of the past isn't right. And they become heretics, and they become apostates. They rebel against the conventional wisdom. And you can sort of see this happening already in the late 15th century, but it becomes particularly remarkable in the 16th and 17th century, when you get thinkers like, say, Copernicus or Galileo or, Descartes, or in very different areas of human inquiry, who basically come around and say, Aristotle is wrong. Allen is wrong. Ptolemy, who described the world, the universe as the earth is in the middle and the sun is turning around it. This is all wrong. And they start changing the world. By the end of the 16th, 17th century, say Isaac Newton basically describes a completely different picture of the universe. But what is true for physics and what is true for astronomy, what is true for medicine, is even true for the humanities. So all of a sudden, in the 17th century, you start people looking at the Holy Bible. Now, the Holy Bible is holy. Every word in it written by God, or so it was believed. And then you get a man like Spinoza, and there are others who basically say, no, the Bible was written by people. Let's analyze it logically and do textual analysis and compare the different books and starts making sense of it. Now, this is, in some way, I want to emphasize, this would have been considered to be sacrilegious in an earlier age. But in the 17th century, this is happening. And the question is why? And let me give you an explanation of why. It's not like Europeans were all of a sudden becoming more tolerant, more open-minded. I mean, that would have been nice to think, but that's not what happens. In fact, we all know that Galileo was put to trial. Lots of other people were. They were persecuted. A few, not a lot. A few people were actually executed. Like Giordano Bruno was burned publicly in 1600 in Rome. So it did happen, but it was rare. And the question is why? And here is my answer. Europe is a coherent community of independent states. A lot of them. And so some of them are fairly large, like England or France, and some of them are very small, like in Germany. They've got these teeny tiny princedoms, and then you have the Low Countries, you have Switzerland, it's very fragmented. And when you have an intellectual who is getting in trouble with his authorities because he is making statements that are considered to be heretical, he always has the option of picking up his suitcases and going somewhere else. And what's more, the fact that he has this option is common knowledge, as we call it in economics. Everybody knows that he can do that. And so there's no point, because all you're going to do is get your really smartest, most creative, most interesting citizens to go and pick up their suitcases and go somewhere else. And in fact, a lot of them did. I can give you lots of examples, but always remember that, Thomas Hobbes, the great philosopher who wrote Leviathan was written in Paris, not in England, even though he was an Englishman. Because at the time, England was intolerant, they didn't like him, there was a revolution going on, so he fled to Paris. Many other examples I can give you how people sort of use this political fragmentation in order to play the authorities against one another. Now, in China, particularly after the final reunification of China in 1279 by Genghis Khan, China remained a single empire from 1279 on all the way until today, right? And so if you got in trouble with the government, there wasn't anywhere you could go, right? And so the market for ideas, I think, becomes more competitive in Europe thanks to this, whereas in China it becomes more and more monopolized. Okay, the Mandarin bureaucracy controls the way in which human capital is formed. Okay, and in fact, this was completely institutionalized by the imperial examinations, which you had to take if you wanted to work for the bureaucracy, which was the sort of the great ambition of every Chinese mother that her son would become a Mandarin. That's not what's happening in Europe. And this makes, I think, a huge difference. Let me give you one more example and we can move on. But, Europe, for instance, once the printing press is invented in the middle of the 15th century, I think right away after that, they invent censorship, right? So there are books that are permitted and there are books that are not permitted because they go against, the conventional wisdom and ta-ta-ta-ta-ta. Now, the problem is this censorship didn't work. And the reason it didn't work is that you were Prince so-and-so and you said, I don't want this book printed in my country. It would be printed somewhere else and then smuggled into this book. Nobody was ever able to prohibit books from entering their country because you can't guard all the borders, and so you can control the printing presses in your country. You cannot. So when Galileo's books, this is just one example. When Galileo's books are placed on the Inquisition's index, which the index is the list of prohibited books, in Italy, you can go and look the books at the library. It's printed in Basel. It's printed in Strasbourg. It's printed in Amsterdam. The Italians couldn't stop that, and then they're being brought back into Italy. And I think that is symbolic of the way Europe worked. And you don't have that in China, and you don't have that in the Ottoman Empire. And I think that makes for a huge difference. So what you get, basically, Abdul, is a market for ideas. People come up with ideas. You know, the world is flat. Or, you know, the sun is in the middle of the universe. No, the Earth. People argue about this, and it's like a competitive idea. But people can enter. There's free entry. There's free exit. There are incentives. And in the end, you know, what you get is a highly competitive marketplace in which people argue, and they argue with evidence, and they argue with mathematics, and they argue with experimental data. And what emerges by the end of the, I would say, 17th, early 18th century is not so much a consensus about science, but a consensus about how to do science. And from that, and that I think is I think a very unique and unusual phenomenon, because what ends up happening is that the ancestor worship of intellectuals, you know, is completely abandoned. Look at today, I mean, how science is done. We don't even study the history of science anymore. You know, how many people read Aristotle's physics? I mean, historians, but you know, if you go to a medical school, okay, how many people teach the history of medicine? They only teach articles that are published in the last 3 years. Everything else is obsolete. So this is an extreme place to be at. We have zero respect for the wisdom of people living in the past. Yeah, you know, a few, you know, people will read Darwin, or they will read Newton, or they will read, you know, some authority of the past, but mostly for entertainment. You know, if you wanted to study chemistry or molecular or astrophysics, you would pick a textbook that was published in 2021. You wouldn't publish a textbook that was published in 2015, let alone in 1700. That, I think, so we have completely switched, but that is not the way the world used to be. The way the world used to be is, you want to know something? Look it up, you know, in the wisdom of our ancient sages. And I think that's something that we have overlooked. We have overlooked it because I don't think people have fully realized how committed we were to intellectual ancestor worship.
You mean apart from the wisdom, the attitude and aptitude also matters? And you define a bit what is the wisdom and attitude and aptitude?
Yeah. So the attitude is what I just described, really. So that's basically an attitude toward, you know, your ancestors. There is another attitude, and then I'll talk about aptitude, but the other attitude, which I find extremely interesting and not easy to explain, is the following. For some reason, Europeans have always been very keen on importing ideas from other civilizations. They did this even in the Middle Ages, and of course where they got most of their good ideas was from the Islamic world. And so they got, for instance, windmills from the Middle East, they got paper from the Middle East. Many of their, you know, the terms that they use, you know, come from Arabic, like algebra. These are words, you know, the AL at the beginning, of course, gives it away. So they were very open about it. Remember, in Europe, we still refer to the decimal system as Arabic numerals. So basically, Europeans says, you know, the implicit idea is we got this from the Arabs, and that's fine. And they what do they call ceramics in English? They call it Chinaware. It tells you we got this from China. There is a technique with using black lacquer called Japanning. So the Europeans have always been very open about this, taking things from other civilizations. So when they finally find their way to the New World after 1492, one of the things that they start doing is they started importing things techniques and crops that they see in the New World and bring them to Europe. So potatoes and maize, to choose just two famous examples. When they reached Asia, they bring tea from Asia, coffee from the Arabic world. I mean, they bring in things from overseas. And this is something that most other civilizations were very reluctant about. It's not a 0-1 kind of variable in the sense that they always did pick up some things from Europe, especially firearms. But look, I mean, the Islamic world, for instance, places a prohibition on the printing of books, which really prevents the printing of any books in Arabic or Turkish until about the middle of the 18th century. That's 300 years in which the printing book existed, the printing press existed, and they weren't printing books. China, basically until late in the 19th century, essentially took the attitude of, if it was important, we would have already invented it. And so there's this sort of reluctance to utilize ideas of other civilizations. And that's an attitude the Europeans never had. And we could argue why that's so, but it is, I think, an important part of the attitude. So the attitudes both toward other civilizations and towards one's own ancestors, I think, are critical in allowing a society to innovate and to grow. Now, as far as aptitude is concerned, so ideas themselves, So ideas themselves, of course, are not enough. You need to carry them out. And so I always show my students pictures of the wonderful inventions of Leonardo da Vinci. So Leonardo da Vinci was this sort of universal genius who invented all kinds of things, submarines and airplanes and balloons and, God knows what. None of the things that he sketched were ever built in his time. And the answer why is very simple. Workmanship and materials. They didn't have the right materials to build the stuff with. And they didn't have the workmanship. So, I'll give you one example I like very much. There was a Dutchman called Cornelis Drebbel. And Cornelis Drebbel was the first man who built a submarine. And he built it, with his own hands, probably had a few people helping him, then I don't know. But he launched it actually in London, of all places, in 1620. And the king came out to see, and there was the submarine going in the Thames. There's pictures of that. It's a wonderful thing, okay? That's the last submarine we see in the world for 250 years. Why? Because they didn't have, you need steel to make a submarine, and you need other things. And they didn't have it. And I think that is critical. You need a cadre, a body of craftsmen, of artisans, who can actually build the thing, not once, but over and over and over again. So scale it up, so to speak. That's what industrialization involved. And Europe really doesn't have that in 1500. I would say that if you look at the quality of artisans, and this is a bit of a speculation, if you look at the quality of artisans in the world in 1500, the artisans in India or in Persia or in China are in many ways superior to those of Europe, and which is why the Europeans go there and they buy stuff because they cannot make it themselves. But over time, Europeans learned by 750, I think, they are making almost everything that they were importing before from the East. And much of the Industrial Revolution is, in fact, this form of import substitution. And eventually they get better at it. You look at cotton. So the history of cotton, which has been written, a couple of really good books about it lately, the history of cotton is very clear. At first, the Europeans were bringing in cotton goods from India, known as calicos, among others. There were others, but calicos is the most famous one. And then they start making it themselves, which is by 1830, they are exporting cotton goods to India. And they're wiping out the Indian cotton industry because the European could make them better and cheaper. The same is true for China, where the same is true for lots of other things. And so that, I think, is quite striking. The European, for a variety of reasons, developed a class of artisans. And indeed, this also explains why Britain was... Listen, the quality of workmen, not so much the inventors themselves, but the people actually did the work in Britain, was probably the highest in the world by 1750. And so you get these people like James Watt, and Arkwright and the famous inventors, but what their success really depended on the hundreds and hundreds of unknown but highly skilled and well-trained craftsmen who build their machinery. And that's what I call aptitudes, okay? That's not an attitude. This is people who are good with their hands. This is a dexterity. Obviously, you need to teach these people how to do this and then give them the freedom to improve it. And that's what you see happening all over Europe in the 18th century, but particularly in England and Scotland.
Great. Professor, you were talking about the institutions, and Ashmoglu from MIT also offers some institutional explanation of economic growth and development, and I know that he is your friend as well. And some other also considers the institutions matter a lot. Can we relate institution with industrial revolution? I mean, what type of institution and why institutions are important? If institutions are important, then what type of institution? I mean, the politics, the incentives, and what type of incentives? I mean.
Yes, well, this is the $64,000 question. How much did institutions matter? And Darren and Jim Robinson are very close friends of mine. I helped them write that book.
Yes, I know that.
And I think they're making an extremely valid point, but I think they're not claiming enough. But because for them, institutions are first and foremost political institutions. They have to do with the state, with the relationship between the ruler. I don't want to call it a government. We today have governments. In the past, they had kings, and so what they are pointing out is that you really need sort of the right kind of government in order to get this kind of phenomenon of an industrial revolution and an sort of economic growth driven by technology. That if you have a extremely bad government that sort of taxes its people, to the maximum, and and prohibits all kinds of things, you're not going to get this. And this is, of course, sort of not debatable. But I would like to point out that there are institutions that are not government related, and that actually may have made as much of a difference. And I'll give you one example, which I make a big deal out of in my book. So what you see happening in Europe in the centuries before the Industrial Revolution is the emergence of an institution that's international, or maybe I should say transnational, which is known at the time as the Republic of Letters. And so they thought of themselves as a political institution, because that's why they call it a republic. But they weren't really a political institution in the sense that this is much more of maybe we would call it today a network. It's really a virtual network. Of course, they didn't have email or Facebook, but they had letters and they had correspondence and they had book publishing. And so they knew of each other and they were in contact with each other. And the Republic of Letter is an institution. It's an institution in the sense that it sets out rules by which knowledge is to be produced. And it sets incentives. And it's both the rules and the incentives that are the core of what we think of when we think of institutions, isn't it? And so the main incentive that scientists had, that innovators had, was reputation. And, you know, the truth is we still have that. You know, if you look at, I mean, I've lived in an academic community for 50 years. And this is what people care about, you know, what do others in my field think of me? That is the key to getting a job. It's the key of getting tenure. It's the key to getting promoted. It's the key to becoming all kind of scientific honors, you know, win prizes, become a member of the academy or this academy or that academy. And at the very peak of this edifice is the Nobel Prize, right? But there are lots of other prizes that people win. It's, you know, and that creates incentives. But it's all based on reputation. But you know, who creates the reputation? Well, there is a community that's not really organized in a formal way. You know, nobody has a membership card, but it's there, and they determine, you know, who's successful, who's going to be published in the top journals, who is going to get, you know, appointed to be a professor at Harvard or, you know, Yale or something like that. I mean, we have these rules, and that kind of system, I think, emerges in the 16th and 17th century. And, you know, its history is reasonably well known and educated people. And what is interesting is they set up the rules of how new knowledge is going to be produced. And I'm not going to go through all the rules, but I'll get. So one rule is basically that everything is contestable. So the contestability issue is really, you know, central. So no matter how famous and how important you are, somebody else can come up and criticize you, you know, and so there are no sacred cows, so to speak. And that really matters. Even the great Newton himself was kind of a god in this world, and clearly reached the very, I mean, he would have won Nobel Prize if there had been one at the time. But even Newton himself was criticized, and, you know, people found mistakes, and they said, you know, I found a mistake in Newton. His Principia is the optics, but never mind. But I found a mistake. Wow. And so this is so contestability, and we still have that, you know. People write papers in physics and chemistry and biology, and other people, you know, review them. And if they find a mistake, they will say it. So everything is contestable. The other rule about this institution is that if you have a new idea, you don't keep it secret, but you publish it. You put it in the public realm. You share it. It's a non-rivalrous good. So the marginal cost of anybody else accessing this is very low. And so basically, if you come up with a new idea, you know, you publish it. You put it in the public domain. And this is really quite, I think, an important innovation, because we still have that today, with a few exceptions in which there are intellectual property rights. Basically, everybody who has a new idea, and certainly in my fields, this is the case, and it's the case in most of science, the first thing you want to do is write a paper and send it to a journal. You want other people to know, which of course relates to this issue of reputation that I talked about. Now, this is not a perfect system, Abdul. I want you to understand, this is not a perfect system. The system has many flaws. Certainly today, you know, a lot of stuff that get published isn't really a new idea at all. I mean, there's a lot of rubbish being published, but that you can't avoid that. It's not perfect, but it works better than anything else. And we have kept it, because the modern world of science is really a product of the 16th and 17th century Republic of Letters. And that's very important to keep in mind, you know, that this is an institution that mattered more than anything else. Remember, in Europe, unlike in China, technological innovation and scientific innovation are basically farmed out to the private sector. The government doesn't really do any of it. there's no real government support for science and for technology until the 20th century. I mean, then you get things like the National Science Foundation and so on, government funding research. But in the period in the 17th and 18th century, this was all done by private individuals, and the funding was, of course, an issue. But that's how it was. So the government's main function, particularly, I think this is true in England, is to get out of the way. Basically, let the private sector do the work, and just give it some support, but in the background. But there are not a lot of cases in which sustainable research was carried out by government. It's not a binary kind of issue. There are some cases in which the government clearly was successful in supporting research, but in Europe it was almost entirely done by the private sector until the 20th century. Then you get this sort of interesting cooperation between government and the private sector. But I think those are the kind of institutional stories that we have to tell. But in the 18th and 19th century, remember, Britain, which is the leading country in the Industrial Revolution, is basically, committed to what we call classical liberalism. Basically, they were committed to a model of laissez-faire in which the government does as little as possible. The continental, nations had somewhat different ideas, but both in Britain and even more so in the United States, the government the United States basically doesn't have much of a government until the 20th century. The federal government does almost nothing. So that's a model, I think, the institutional model that turns out to be successful in the West. I hasten to add, Abdul, this is important, that the fact that it's worked this way in the past does not mean that it's the only way in which you can have technological success. It is possible that there are models, and the Chinese experiment will be, a test of this, that a nation in which the government plays a very central role in the production and diffusion of knowledge, that nation can be successful. Have to wait and see how the Chinese experiment plays out. But certainly in the past, I would say governments played, all things considered, government plays a relatively more passive role. What mattered are these sort of non-governmental institutions that I described earlier.
And what about the elite class? Do you think that the elites matter in economic history? Did they help to set up institution and define the rules of the game of the economy of the Industrial Revolution?
Did you say elites?
Elites class, yes, elites, yes.
Yeah. Well, and so I have sort of advanced a concept which this is not going to make me very popular, I think, but I think it's right, which is that essentially scientific and technological progress, and therefore the entire economic progress of society, are driven by a relatively small group of people who are in the sort of upper tail of the distribution of human capital. Okay, so the top, I don't know how many percentage it really is, and that depends on what question you're asking. But basically, this is a sensitive problem, because what I would argue is that what people have been writing about human capital and education and knowledge have been arguing is that we need to raise the level of education of the entire population. And I'm for that. I'm not against that. That's not what. But if you ask yourself, who are the people who are pushing the envelope? Who are people who are making society advance? It's a small number of people. It's maybe 3% of the labor force. It's the engineers, it's the chemists, it's mathematicians, people like physicists, people like that, and what the others know, what the other 95% of the population knows, may be important for some purposes, but it isn't critical to progress. And so progress in the United States, for instance, today is being, I'll give you a list of 20 institutions, all the way from Caltech and MIT down, including my own institution, I would hope. But, after you're done with 25 or 30 institutions, basically, you've covered the vast bulk of where progress is being carried out. Then there's some private institutions, of course, there's some corporations, but even there, the vast bulk of progress is carried out by their R&D departments, which employs, usually a minority of all workers. So we're looking at 2 or 3% of the population, and it's arguable that a good policy for progress would be to concentrate resources on those people who bring about progress. The difficulty, of course, is that you don't know who these people are. So you need a system to identify them. I understand that. But by and large, I think what really is at the pivot, at the core of progress in any field that you care about. And people have accused me of being elitist, and I'm not. I'm just not making an elitist or non-elitist statement. I'm just saying this is a good description of how it actually happened. Now, you can make good arguments that you want people to be across the board to be well educated because it would make them better citizens, it would make them behave better, it would make them enjoy life better. I'm in favor of all that. But from the point of view of who is going to come up with the next vaccine, COVID-19, it's a few thousand people, and we know who they are. and they're pushing the envelope. It is not the rest of us. And that's always been like that, it's always been like that. The vast bulk of the population may have been illiterate or at least poorly educated. And in a way that didn't matter.
Do you think that we are now in the midst of the third industrial revolution or the fourth industrial revolution, which is driven by this technological developments and information and communication technology?
Well, I've been asked this question many times, and of course, the easy answer is, well, that during the first industrial revolution, most people didn't know they were living during the first industrial revolution, put on it much later. And so maybe people living through maybe the moniker of an industrial revolution should only be applied ex post. But more seriously, perhaps, I think that we are living sort of almost like through a perpetual industrial revolution, that the rate of progress of science and technology in our own age is so fast that it would be very difficult to identify areas of periods of acceleration and deceleration. What happens is, of course, the ways progress is achieved differs depending on how science develops and depending on the challenges facing. So it has been said that the 20th century was the age of physics and the 21st century will be the age of biology. And there's something to be said for that, because the progress in molecular biology in different fields, whether it's molecular immunology, molecular virology, bacteriology, and so on, that age has opened technological horizons that we really didn't dream about even 30, 40 years ago. You think about things like genetic editing, for instance, the sort of CRISPR technique that was developed a few years ago. And now the last few years, the newspapers have been full about, messenger RNA. I mean, there's been incredible progress. And so, but at the same time, I think we are facing by far the greatest physical challenge that the human race has ever faced, which is climate change. And this will require major developments in all kinds of scientific areas that will help us, if not reverse it, which I think is unlikely, also one never knows, but certainly adapt to it and live with it. And this will, and I think so that will be the next industrial revolution. How do we cope with what we have done to the planet? That's going to be, a huge issue. But I'm optimistic largely because I'm looking at what we know today, Abdul, compared to what we knew even 30 years ago, let alone 100 years ago. I mean, I've just given a lecture. I'll tell you this as an aside. I've just given a lecture comparing how we responded to the coronavirus to what happened in 1918 with the great Spanish flu epidemic. And it's absolutely mind-boggling. People in 1918 didn't know anything about what it was that hit them. They didn't even know it was a virus, let alone that they would have been capable of identifying the virus, of sequencing its genome, and then coming up with ways in dealing with the spike protein. I mean, they wouldn't know a spike protein. They didn't know these things existed. And so we have made enormous progress in a century. A century is not a very long time in the history of mankind. With the progress that we've made since then is far larger than the progress that we have made. The integral of all the progress we've made since the beginning of mankind until 1918 is a teeny tiny speck compared with the progress we have made in those fields in the last 100 years. And of that, most of it has been happening in the last 20 or 30 years, given that we have better instruments, better tools, better microscopes, better lab techniques, and on and on and on. And so I think that once you start realizing that, the concept of an industrial revolution, in which you have this sudden flourishing compared to what was before, is relevant, but it's perpetual. We're going to live through a continuous industrial revolution in which things are going to keep improving across the board. In biology, but also, for instance, in a big field of manufacturing will be three-dimensional printing. It will be material science, which is closely connected to it. It will be digital technology. Who knows where it's going to be? Nobody can predict it, but that there will be progress, I am completely certain of, because the knowledge base is there. But what's more important is the incentives are there. People, even today, as much as any other time in the past, the people working on the frontier of science, they want to build a reputation. They want to become celebrities. They want to be rock stars. Dr. Fauci in the United States, he's a rock star. He's a celebrity. Everybody knows who he is. But so are other, major scientists who have, contribute to. It gives me some kind of confidence that progress will continue ever faster. I'm not going to live to see, where it develops in 50 years, but I'm optimistic. In that regard, I am very optimistic. I think we will be capable of coming up with the technological tools to deal with climate change. It will be expensive, it will be painful, but we can do it because we are not as clueless and as hapless as people were in 1918 when they were hit by the Spanish flu.
Good. Professor, one question for in case of Pakistan. There is a phrase in Pakistan that we should think out of box. And now my question is that, according to you, what is the out of box for us? Importantly, what is the box in our case in the age of ICT and artificial intelligence?
But I have never been in Pakistan. I've been in next door in India, but I've never been in Pakistan. So it'd be, very presumptuous of me to make deep statements about a country where I've never been and which I have never studied. But I would say that if there's two possibilities for developing economies, okay, and I think the most important one, is not so much to think outside the box as to adapt itself to frontier technologies that are developed elsewhere. So, for instance, if you look at a country like India or Southern Asia, where their successes are coming from is manufacturing products or producing services that have been developed elsewhere, but doing it better and cheaper. So you think about Bangladesh's textile industry, India's pharmaceutical industries, things like that. So most of the things that are produced in India have been developed elsewhere, and they are basically just producing generic. Also, that's no longer 100% true. They're now doing some developing themselves, and God bless them. I hope they succeed. But I think that is, a road to success that has been followed for a much longer period by countries like Taiwan and South Korea and so on. Remember, Taiwan and South Korea were once underdeveloped, poor economies. And now Taiwan is the world's leading producer of microprocessors, and Korea is one of the main producers of automobiles. I mean, our country is full of Korean-made automobiles, and so on and so forth. Now, in all due respect to South Korea, they did not invent the automobile. They just learned to make a really good product inexpensively, and that's done a great deal of good to them. Now, the other model, and that's harder to follow, is the model of a country that is technologically at the frontier, that manages to elbow itself to a technological frontier. And the example, of course, that comes to mind is Israel. So in Israel, the saying goes, it's not that we think outside the box. They say, there is no box. And so Israel has been extremely successful in, not just being on the frontier, but pushing the frontier. And this is true if you look at its Israeli economy. It's not just been true for digital technology. I mean, they have developed a lot of software and a lot of hardware that is being used all over the world. But it's the same is true in biology and in medicine. I mean, they have been on the frontier of the war against COVID. And so, but it's true in agriculture, it's true all over the place. So it's a very but in order to do that, you really do need to build a strong core of this sort of upper tail human capital, which Israel has been very good at. And they have developed techniques, both through the government and both in the private sector, in which they're able to identify the smartest and most creative people, and basically say, all right, you guys go, here's a lab, here's a firm, go and invent something. And they do. But that takes major cultural and social transformations, and it takes a government that realizes that. And what it takes is a complete willingness to engage in novel things, and a willingness to put up with failure. Because, of course, when you're looking at somebody pushing the frontier, always keep in mind that out of 100 new ideas, 99 of them are failures. One will succeed, but you don't know which one. So you got to do all of them in order to get to the one that actually will produce that software that will help you drive your car, or that material that will protect you against, extreme heat, and so on and so forth. And so that, I think, is the other model. So I will not go and give the government of Pakistan policy advice, because I never give any goodies to any government, to tell you the truth. I don't think. Well, I don't really think that I'm qualified. I don't think I'm qualified. I studied the past. I try to understand the past. But my main conclusion about the present is that it's very different from the past. So the lessons that I learned from the past are not in any way immediately applicable to the present. There's some things that you hope will repeat, but that is so unique and so exceptional that the way things were in the past may not be a very good key to what we should do or can do.
Professor, one thing, a lighter question. You know that every historian or every economic historian must have a favorite date or event or era or a story. And what is yours? Your
Oh man, that's a hard one. I guess I am particularly interested in the last 40 years of the 18th century. So the period between 1760 and 1800. And the reason I am interested in it, and I'll tell you, is it. Look, I mean, we have in Europe we have the 18th century is often known as the Age of Enlightenment, and so what exactly the Enlightenment was is a long and complicated debate I'm not going to get into. But basically, one of the things that really were very much part of it, was not the only thing, but is a belief in progress. So a belief that people can, improve their lives. And in what direction, of course, remains somewhat debated. For an economist, of course, the main thing would be interesting would be material progress, right? So economic growth, GDP, national income, industrial production, agricultural productivity, all those things. But people meant progress in more general terms. And so maybe it's scientific progress. Maybe we should understand the world better. Maybe it's institutional progress. We should throw out bad governments, we get the French Revolution and you get the American Revolution. We have a bad government. We'll replace it by a government that is better in some definable way. But there's a general belief that history can move in a unidirectional trend. Maybe not, monotonic, maybe there are setbacks, but by and large, things are getting better. And this is something that is, in fact, fairly rare in human history. I mean, for most places and most societies that ever existed, people believe that history moves in cycles. It goes up, it goes down, it goes up and down. But as the Bible says, the generation cometh and generation goeth, and there is nothing new under the sun. And that's in the book of Ecclesiastes, famous sort of statement. And I think that's not the period I'm talking about. Basically proves that's wrong. There is progress in human history, and we know more than people. Better. People live twice as long. I mean, that's an achievement that boggles the mind. Infant mortality has gone down from, some unbelievably high number, like 250 per 1,000 children born would die in their first year almost anywhere in the world in 1800. Today, it's like 4. I mean, this is an achievement that's beyond, that is progress, okay? No matter what your beliefs, no matter what your religion, no matter what your ideology, fewer dead children is good by every set of values, right? I mean, this is something we can agree on. And it's not just that fewer dead children, it's also the quality of life in general. Look, I'm in my 70s, okay? And so, look what medicine has done for me. I mean, I had cataract surgery. I can see you very clearly. I have a metal hip. I can walk very well. I mean, this is things that modern technology has done for me. So this is something that really comes to the forefront in those years, in the second half of the 18th century. That's when, you read a French philosopher like Condorcet, for instance, or Turgot, these are the great minds of the late Enlightenment. And they basically say, look, things are going to get better, they can get better, and here is how to make them better. And now this turned out to be a complicated thing because the Enlightenment produced not only the Industrial Revolution and the rise of democracies, it also produced Hitler and Stalin. So, it's not like everything was getting better all the time. But, excuse me, but things have gotten on average better. And the number of people who live in poverty, it's still large, but it's a lot less large used to be. And I always tell my students, that one of the real miracles of modernity is that there are lots of societies, particularly in Europe, but not only in Europe, where poverty has essentially disappeared. So Jesus said, the poor will always be with you in the New Testament. And there are countries in the world in which that is really no longer true. You go to Switzerland, you go to Zurich, or you go to Copenhagen, or you go to Dublin or Vienna. You don't see many poor people. You see people who are rich, you see people who are middle class, people who maybe, some people are still, not wealthy, but poverty in the sense that you may not have enough to eat tomorrow, or you may not be able to afford medical care tomorrow, has disappeared in some countries. And I think that's an amazing achievement. I mean, in 1700, nowhere, there wasn't a place in the world in which people weren't poor. Everywhere people were poor. There's a thin layer of rich people, and then everybody else is poor. And they could starve to death the next day. Well, that's still true in large parts of the world, unfortunately. It's certainly true in much of Africa, and in some places of Latin America and Asia, but it is becoming less and less true. And hopefully, if we don't screw up, within a century, every city in the world will be like Zurich, and that would be wonderful. But the notion that could happen and how to bring it about really ripened between 1750 and 1800 in a small number of European countries, in northern Italy, in France, in England, in the Netherlands, in Germany, and so on. And that is, I think, the key to a great deal of history that comes after. Yes.
Great, Professor. I know that I'm taking you a lot of time. Just my second last question. What are the key issues that economic historian should be focusing their research on today?
Well, as I said, the big issue remains, of course, the roots of the great enrichment. But I would maybe phrase it maybe a little bit different today. And here is what I want to think about. We have, in the last 250 years, become much richer. And but we have become richer at a price. And the reason that happens is because technology in general, when you innovate, you're going into the unknown. You're going to a place that nobody's been before. And what happens is that some of it is good and some of it is bad. And you don't know in advance how bad the bad is going to be and how good the good is going to be. So the big example of that, and this is of course something that we will have to cope with more and more, is the burning of fossil fuels. So one of the things that the Industrial Revolution did, it basically brought to the fore the use of coal, and a little bit after coal we got oil and we got natural gas, but these are all fossil fuels that were used with great success in developing economies. And people burned these things happily, and they said, well, isn't this wonderful? There's lots of this stuff in the ground and we can burn it, and we're going to run machinery, and we're going to be able to heat things, and so on and so forth. And then, it started dawning on us in the last 30 years that this had a tremendous cost, and which wasn't realized because the whole notion of greenhouse gases wasn't really part of the scientific consensus until maybe 30, 40 years ago. And so it turns out that a lot of technology has these unexpected side effects. One of them is environmental, as I said. It's not just global warming, it's also air pollution, for instance. My understanding is there are towns today, I don't know how things are in Islamabad, but my understanding is that in places like Delhi, for instance, air pollution is responsible for cutting people's life expectancy by 5 years. That's serious. And so there's a lot of environmental and consequences of economic growth. And there are the social ones, growth of inequality. So maybe economic growth means that everybody is getting richer, but some people get richer a lot faster than others, and that creates all kind of social and political. So what I think we should do in economic history, look at economic growth and try to assess its full consequences, not just sing a song of praise as I've been doing for the last hour, of course, but also point out that, this thing had all kind of unexpected consequences, and there are very few major technological breakthroughs that don't have some kind of negative social costs. I mean, you think about the invention of the automobile, for instance, okay? Forget global warming, just the invention of the automobile. The automobile has been a wonderful liberating invention that gave, even relatively poor people, a chance to, go wherever they wanted, when they wanted. But we also know that the automobile has had a huge social cost and that it has in many ways destroyed urban life in most cities in the world, not just in Europe, everywhere. I mean, you try to drive in Cairo, or in Calcutta, or in Tokyo, or in Tel Aviv. It doesn't matter where you go. I mean, there's too many cars, and they obviously aren't, have caused major environmental and human costs to society. So I think we should be more aware of the sort of the full social costs of economic growth, and maybe because we haven't taken all the costs. The other issue which I am fascinated by, now you got me going on this, and this is an issue that I have been teaching for many years, and I don't think there's enough research done about this, but there is something very odd about humans, which I want to point out to you. And I don't have an answer. I'm just going to raise a question because I don't know the answer. But here is the question. Charles Darwin taught us that every species on this planet, when it has a favorable material environment in which it can thrive, okay, it will start reproducing. It will start increasing its numbers. Right? And it will keep increasing its numbers until it hits some kind of ceiling in which it exhausts the food supply or something else happens, and then it reaches some kind of an equilibrium. But as long as the conditions, the material conditions around it are favorable, its numbers will increase. Right? That's how every animal and every plant is being genetically programmed. This is known as superfecundity. Okay, so as long as the environment is favorable, your numbers will increase. This is sort of a commonplace observation. There's one exception to that rule, and that's us. Because for the last 100 years, we have been getting richer and richer, and the way we responded to that is not having fewer. And so today, in almost every country in the world, we are experiencing a sharp decline in the birth rate and in fertility rates. And the net consequence, of course, is that there will be population growth slow down, and by now it's predicted to sort of end. World population is going to reach some peak in 2040, and then it will start declining. Not very rapidly, but it will start declining. So, but not only that, but we are getting older on average, right? We have fewer babies and we live longer, so the average age of the population is growing. This has all kind of interesting effects. The fundamental issue is, why is it that we don't behave like every other species on this planet in that regard? I mean, we did in the past. I mean, Reverend Malthus still pointed out that, if you give people higher wages and you give them a better material environment, they will have bigger families. And everybody thought this was true. And this turned out to be one of the most egregious mistakes anybody's ever made, thinking you give people more money, you give them more to eat, you give them better housing, they will have more babies. No, they're having fewer babies. Is why do we behave like that? And I have a long lecture about this. It will take 2 hours, in which I suggest all kinds of mechanisms, some of them more obvious than others. But this strikes me as an extremely interesting and important issue, because it goes to the heart of where humanity is going.
Great. Professor, just last one thing. For us are some concluding remarks from your side.
Oh man. Concluding, well, let me put it this way, okay? As I said, I have built a career on using economics to teach history and using history to teach economics. And that's a field that we call sort of economic history. And the last, I would say, 20 years have been incredibly exciting for it. And the field has been growing very rapidly. And the main reason it's been growing, and this is obviously delighting me, is that we have better technologies in working on data. And so when I was a graduate student in W, I would go to the computer center and run a regression that had 40 observations in it. And I would say, oh my God, 40 observations, that's a big sample. I mean, I hope the computer doesn't explode, it fails to invert that matrix, because otherwise, I can't interpret my coefficients and this, blah, blah, blah. And today, my graduate students routinely are working with observations, 500,000 observations, 2 million observations. One of my colleagues has 30 million. I mean, our access to data is unbelievable. But it's not just that. It's not only that we can process data, we can collect them, we assemble them, because we have, OCR, we can read documents through using machine learning, in which we don't have to sit there and pore over thousands and thousands of tables. We have a machine that does this for us and puts these numbers into spreadsheets that we can analyze. And what that really means is that we can learn about the past we ever could, that this is incredibly exciting. And, it's wonderful to see this, because there were times when people told me, economic history, that's a field that's declining. All it is just sort of economic with bad data and so on and so forth. And it turns out to be that the field is expanding very rapidly. And a lot of people who are not trained as and you mentioned Asimoglu, I can mention many others. They're all reading history, they're all writing history, they care about history, they talk about history. I can give you a list of 10 or 15 major economists in the US and in England and elsewhere who are doing historical stuff. Everybody is interested in history today. And you know what? I'll tell you something more. I said we are the only species that doesn't follow superfecundity. We are also the only species on this planet who are interested in their own past. Think about that. No other species know anything about their past. We do. And this is what makes us people. This is what makes us human.
Thanks a lot, Professor. Definitely, it's a very wonderful talk. I shall definitely invite you for another talk exclusively on growth and the population growth. Today, this is really a memorable day for me as well, because
well, thank you so much. You're very kind, Abdul.
You don't know, I read your first article about 20 years back when I started my career in economics. And from that day, I remember that there will be one day that I will talk to Mokyr. So thank you very much for all this. Thank you, Air. We shall meet in next week with some other good topic. Till then, bye-bye. Allah Hafiz. Thank you.
Well, and Happy New Year.
Happy New Year. Thank you. Thank you, Joel. Thank you.
All the best.
All the best. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye. Bye-bye.